Hello and welcome. Let's start with the latest on Angola fuel hike protests. The death toll has dramatically risen to 22 from the previous estimate of 4. Violence erupted on Monday when taxi drivers called for a 3-day strike to protest the increase in fuel costs. The deadly clashes continued on Tuesday, marking some of the worst unrest in the country in several years. Looting, vandalism and clashes with police started in the capital Luanda and then spread to other provinces. Sporadic gunfire was heard across the capital and several other cities on both days. And this is what 2 days of violent protests have led to. At least 22 people were killed, including a police officer. Nearly 200 were injured. Over 1,200 were arrested. 66 shops and 25 vehicles were vandalized, and some supermarkets and warehouses were looted. As tense calm returns to the capital, the streets remain largely empty and many shops are shut, with a heavy presence of security forces. Public transport is slowly resuming after a 2-day standstill, but tensions still remain high across the country. When the latest wave of protests began 2 weeks ago, human rights groups accused the police of using excessive force against protesters. Authorities have often been accused of clamping down harshly on protests to silence dissent in Angola. The oil-rich African nation has been gradually removing fuel subsidies since 2023, when a petrol price hike also triggered deadly protests. The government's move to lower its heavy fuel subsidies reportedly came after the International Monetary Fund called for more public money to be spent on health and education. But the people are clearly not happy with it. Angola has a population of 36 million, and more than half of the population lives on less than $3.65 per day. Inflation stands at around 20%, and unemployment rate is at nearly 30%. As per the World Bank, inflation and limited growth are likely to keep poverty rates high at around 36% by the year 2026. The people have accused the MPLA government of corruption and have expressed their discontent with President João Lourenço, who was re-elected for a second 5-year term in 2022. The MPLA party has been governing Angola for 50 years. The opposition parties have also condemned the government for creating policies that have pushed Angola into a severe economic and social crisis. Public anger over the government's indifferent attitude is growing, and though the protests have come to a halt for now, without concrete policy changes, such unrest cannot be eliminated, but just postponed at the best. And for more on this, we have with us Kani Magubane, a political analyst who is joining us live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Kani, thank you for being with us.
It's only a pleasure.
Now, what are the underlying economic and political factors that contributed to the fuel price hike in Angola, and why has this specific subsidy cut triggered such intense protests across the country?
Well, I think one of the biggest triggers of the current violence that we see, I think can be placed squarely at the door of funders like the IMF, who have encouraged the decrease of subsidies. And we know that since 2023, subsidies have been decreased. And what are these subsidies? Well, as much as Angola may be an oil-rich country, but they have a very minimal refinery capacity. So in other words, they have very limited resources and abilities to take this oil and to industrialize industrialize it into a fuel that the country can use. Because if Angola had actually worked towards increasing its capacity in fuel refinery, we wouldn't be seeing this current situation, because they import the fuel as much as they do have the raw oil. And because of the costs of importing, government had been subsidizing importers for the longest time, and that has managed to keep costs at a particular level. Now, the drop of subsidies has actually then had a ripple on effect, because those businesses who are now affected have had to pass on the costs, and they've passed on the cost to the taxi industry by increasing the price of fuel, and the taxi industry has in turn passed on cost to the passengers, who are now feeling the brunt of an over 50% increase almost overnight of transport costs. And these are causing a lot of pressure within an already pressurized economic system. And I think that this protest is more than just about a fuel crisis. It's actually the cry of Angolan people who are saying, we need economic change, we need political change. The MPLA, I don't think, is the choice of the people anymore. And I think these protests are a clear indication of that.
Right. And how has the government of Angola responded to the escalating violence, and what measures are being taken to restore peace and stability? Do you think these measures will effectively address the root causes of the unrest?
I don't think so, because at the moment, the government has been concentrating more on restoring order. We know that the military has been out, the police have been out, in the streets, and actually bringing protests to an end. And some of those skirmishes have been very violent between police and protesters. Now, in a place like Luanda, which is in another region of Angola, a 16-year-old teenager was shot and killed by the police because they were part of protesters who were actually going to the MPLA offices, to protest this current fuel crisis. And I think that we can also look at the amount of years that MPLA has been in power. We know that in the SADC region, there have been many political changes that have taken place. And Luanda is having its own moment, I think, of a revolution, in its modern day times. We know that they've faced many civil wars in the past. They've been repressed, under the former President Dos Santos, who was running the country for many years. And in many instances, this was supposed to be Angola's time, for political reforms, for social reforms, for economic reforms. This was supposed to be Angola's time. But what we are seeing is the heavy-handed influence of funding bodies like the IMF, who've been criticized time and time again of their interference in domestic politics and domestic affairs.
And Kani, in terms of regional implications, what role do these protests play in Angola's broader socio-political landscape? And how might they impact the country's international relations or economic stability moving forward?
Well, Angola is on the back foot. They need the IMF. They need all of these international funders, because economically, Angola is in no position to stand by its own. And as such, they are at the mercy of many organizations. And I can almost say that Angola is not autonomous, as much as they are not directly colonized by the Portuguese anymore, but they don't have authority of their own. I think that the president and his cabinet are still very much at the mercy, of the West. And this has then brought back into the focus in terms of foreign ownership of African autonomy. We've seen what has happened with Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, as he has pushed France aside. In many ways, France has retaliated and saying that they will, rescue the people of Burkina Faso from Traoré. However, the people on the ground are very happy with how he's been progressing, because he's putting the African agenda first, and he's fighting against the historic colonialism. And in many ways, this is what Angolans are calling for. They're calling for Angolan solutions to African problems and to Angolan problems, because because they have the natural resources, they have the oil. And so the question we must ask is, who does this chaos benefit? Who benefits out of this chaos? Because it's certainly not the people of Angola.
Right. Connie, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Firstpost now available in 9 languages on YouTube. English,
Stands at $36 trillion.
French,
Le FMI, comme
German,
Geschäftsführenden Direktor
Hindi,
$30 trillion kakarjo.
Indonesian,
Pemerintah tanpa pemeriksaan.
Italian,
Sekali radikali.
Japanese,
4兆ドル以上も
Portuguese,
por causa do próprio balanço patrimonial.
Spanish.
Beautiful bill.
Go to Settings, click on Audio Track and select a language of your choice. Be the first to know what's happening around you in your first language. Firstpost.